Hello there, Atheist Morph. Barely a week goes past on Twitter without me seeing somebody, usually a Christian, saying something along the lines of, there's 2.2 billion Christians in the world. They can't all be wrong. This is a look at the Ad Populum Fallacy. So, present estimates are that there's 2.2 billion Christians in the world, and there's around 7.7 billion. So 2/7 or about 28.5% of the world's population is Christian. So actually, Christians aren't even the majority. So surely, if what's most popular is true, non-Christian must be true. Not to mention, as I have in an earlier video, that there's about 33,000 sects of Christianity, which dilutes them somewhat because they all believe slightly different things. So, if Christianity is true, whose version of it is true? The version that most people subscribe to? It's estimated that sometime in the future, there'll actually be more Muslims in the world than Christians. At that point, will Allah be the one true God and not Yahweh? Now, if we look at this list here of the top 20 religions, except it's got secular there at number 3, and of course, secular, agnostic, atheism, those things are not actually religions. Well, if the most popular is actually going to be the true one, because the majority of people can't be wrong, why doesn't everybody just be Christian? Why isn't everybody in the world Christian if the majority view is correct? Now, consider this. We looked at this in an earlier video. This is a view of cosmology that's consistent with the Bible. This was the prevailing cosmology in the Middle East at around the time the Bible was being written. We've got a flat earth, and we've got a solid dome above it called the firmament. And in that firmament is set the sun and the moon and all of the stars. And see how much smaller they are than the earth. The earth is the very center of this universe, and everything else is around the earth. And it says in the Bible, in more than one verse, and we'll look at some of those in a moment, that stars can fall to earth. Well, we're going to look at just how ridiculous that statement is.
Consider this video about the relative sizes of the stars and planets. So we're starting off here with Pluto, which is no longer considered a planet. And the moon is bigger than Pluto. Mercury is bigger than the moon. Mars is bigger than Mercury. The next one will be Venus. Venus is bigger than Mars. And then we have the Earth, which is very slightly bigger than Venus. And then we're going to compare the Earth to some of the gas giants. Now, just look at Neptune coming in from the side there. It's much, much bigger than the Earth. Uranus is slightly bigger than Neptune. Saturn, bigger than that. You can see it coming in from the side now. And of course, the largest planet in our solar system is Jupiter. And then compare them all to the size of our sun, just coming up there. The planets are tiny compared to the sun. And as we're about to see, the sun isn't even a particularly big star. Just look at this. And compare what we're seeing with the biblical view of the universe, which you can see in the top left-hand corner, where the Earth is much, much bigger than the Sun and the Moon, and the stars are tiny in comparison. This is totally the opposite to what we know to be true now. And while I'm talking about this, notice how these stars are getting bigger and bigger. Look at the star going off of the side of the screen on the left-hand side. It's tiny compared to those coming in. And the sun went off the screen some time ago. The sun is microscopic compared to some of these huge stars. So tell me, how can the Bible claim that stars can fall to Earth? As it does, for example, in Mark 13:25. Or in Matthew 24:29. And the stars shall fall from heaven. Or in Revelation 6:13. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth. Tell me, how can something the size of this fall onto something the size of the earth? The dot is the sun compared to the largest known star.
So let's have a little bit more of a look at VY Canis Majoris, the largest known star. So if this is that star, in the box here, which we can't even see on this scale, is the sun. And here we have an enlargement of the box, and the sun is this few pixels here, and this is just a small arc of VY Canis Majoris. Now if we look at the sun and scale to the earth, look how large the sun is compared to the earth. So when people wrote this type of thing, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, they must have thought that the stars were just those small little points of light, exactly as they could see them in the firmament. They had no idea of the scale of something like this. It's worth noting that this star is also at a distance of 6,400 light years from the Earth. How would something this big fall to something so small over such a large distance? People who think that the Bible is inerrant really should think about things like this. But as to how this relates to this particular video, this was something that the majority of people believed at the time. And they were wrong. So while we're on cosmology, let's look at another idea that the majority held. The idea that the Earth was at the centre of not just the solar system, but the entire universe, a so-called geocentric model. The opposition to that the sun is at the centre of the solar system, the so-called heliocentric model, that was first proposed in 230 BC by Aristarchus of Greece. However, the idea didn't really catch on. The next person credited with the idea was Nicholas Copernicus. So very much later, sort of 15th century, I believe, Copernicus. But this heliocentric model wasn't really confirmed until later Galileo, who was born just slightly after Copernicus' death, turned his telescope to the heavens and actually made some measurements and observations that showed that the sun was actually the centre of the solar system. This caused much consternation in the Catholic Church. However, we now know that this view is correct. The sun is at the centre of our solar system. Our solar system is not even near the centre of our galaxy. It's out on one of the spiral arms. And our galaxy is not even remarkable. It's just one of many galaxies in a cluster of galaxies amongst tens of thousands of galaxies that we can observe. But the whole idea of the Earth being at the centre of the solar system, and indeed the universe, that was a majority-held view. Most people thought that back in the 1400s and 1500s. And guess what? They were wrong. Giordano Bruno, a visionary in many cosmologists' eyes, suggested that stars were in fact just like our sun, but just further away, and that many of them had their own planetary systems. This was a highly unorthodox view. It went against the majority, and it certainly went against the church, and for this suggestion, he was burnt at the stake. So Bruno lived in the 1500s. The majority of people just thought the stars were tiny little pinpoints, what they could see. We now know that Bruno was right. We know that the stars are just like our sun, many of them much bigger, some of them smaller, and they're just a long way away. And we also know now that many of them do have their own planetary systems. So if you go back to the 1500s, the majority of people believed something that was wrong.
So now let's look at something else. Let's look at continental drift. What I'm showing here is an animation of the last 1,000 million years. I'm told that we have very good data for this, and therefore this movement is accurate, whereas prior to that there's more and more estimation involved. At the moment you can see that there's not too much that's familiar, but as we move forward, the continents that you know and love from your maps, from geography class and so on, will become apparent. The idea that large structures like continents can move like this is a relatively recent one. The earliest record I can see of anybody even suggesting continental drift is from Abraham Ortelius in 1596. He got the idea by looking at Africa and South America and seeing that, as many of us did when we did geography class in school, that Africa and South America seemed to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw. But it certainly wasn't believed by the majority of the public at that time. Just odd people like Ortelius who made the argument, and there were a series of people between him and Alfred Wegener, who we'll talk about shortly. But certainly the vast majority of people prior to the 1960s would never have believed that continents can move like this. And this last little section brings us up to the present day.
The person most credited with the idea of continental drift is Alfred Wegener. And he worked in the early 1900s, and he was a geologist and a meteorologist, mainly a meteorologist. And it was the fact that it wasn't his discipline that actually caused a lot of scientists to ignore his ideas. But he made observations that in mountain ranges he could see similar geologic formations and even similar fossils, although this had been observed earlier. And up to a certain time, and then obviously if these continents move apart, then what happens to the animals on this side and this side is going to be different. And the rock formations are going to be slightly different as well as they move apart. So he had the idea that at some time some of the continents must have been together and then moved apart. Now this was in the early 1900s. But this was an idea that wasn't accepted until the mid-1960s. Although by the mid-1960s, people had actually proposed mechanisms by which this could happen, which Wegener didn't, or at least his mechanisms were not plausible. Now, everything about continental drift is still not understood. It's ongoing research. However, there's not much doubt that it happens. And we can trace it back throughout the entire history of the Earth, although it's only accurate to about 1,000 million years ago, as I said during the clip. Now we can actually trace the movement of the continents with GPS. We can actually see this happening in real time. So there's no doubt that this is a real thing. Continental drift happens and has happened in the past. So now we have the opposite of what we had with our earlier examples. We have a situation here where once there was something that nobody believed, or virtually nobody believed, but it actually turned out to be true. Now let's move to something else. Let's look at disease and the spread of disease, contagion. In ancient Sumeria, people believed that disease was all down to demonic possession. Something was possessing the person. And unfortunately, this view persists to today, because there's virtually never a week goes by that you don't hear about some child dying while the parents prayed to remove the demon from their body. The Catholic Church still performs exorcisms based on this theory that goes back to ancient Sumeria. However, the majority had moved on by medieval times, and they had a concept called miasma, or bad air. They thought it was smells in the air that caused disease. So at least they were closer than the demonic people. In most of the world now, we have the germ theory of disease. We know that many diseases are caused by bacteria or viruses or perhaps even fungi. But let's look at what happened. So if you go back to the ancient world, many people believed that it was demonic possession. And they were wrong. We go forward to medieval times, and the majority of people believed it was this miasma, or bad air. And they were wrong. So it seems that throughout history, the majority can all believe something, and it can be wrong. If you want to see a situation where the majority of people believe something and they're actually wrong, all you have to do is watch any episode of QI. Every week they expose things that the majority of people believe, but it's actually not right. For example, there is a widespread idea that science cannot explain how the bumblebee flies. And this is just poppycock. Science can explain this perfectly. So, throughout this video, we've seen several examples where a majority believed something to be true, and it wasn't. And we also, with the plate tectonics, saw an example where nobody believed something, and it turned out to be true. This leads us to a conclusion that the number of people that believe a particular proposition is independent of whether that proposition is actually true. And I use true here as in concordant with facts.